Well, let's continue the conversation around AGOA and take you to Uganda and that country criticizing the United States' decision to remove it from the major trade pact. The United States announcing earlier in the week that it was cutting Uganda from the AGOA Summit from January next year. President Joe Biden citing gross violations of human rights and not complying with the criteria. But Kampala is warning that the move could harm the farmers and small businesses. The Central African Republic, Gabon and Niger have also been snubbed from the forum. Let's speak now to the writer and commentator on African affairs. His name, Joseph Ochieno, who joins us now for this conversation. Mr. Ochieno, thank you very much for your time. So let's begin with perhaps how beneficial AGOA has been for Uganda. Has it been a useful agreement that has been put to good use in that country?
I mean, quite clearly, the benefits for AGOA and the principle of AGOA means that any nation state included in the program should benefit. And of course, particularly that it will benefit small industries, small-scale industries, and many of those ones who do not hit the Johannesburg Stock Exchange numbers or figures or names. And in many cases, those that employ very ordinarily low-level, low-key employees about whom you and I not necessarily hear. So it's extremely important. But that said, this is a political move by the U.S., absolutely right. Of course, it's their privilege, their nation states. AGOA came into the year 2000. At the time, I was ahead of an external bureau of Uganda People's Congress in the UK, and an opposition political party, and we were in exile. Political parties were banned in Uganda. So AGOA came in, and around that time, 2 U.S. presidents visited Uganda. So, talking human rights, around the same time, most of northern Uganda was, the citizens were living in concentration camps. So quite clearly, this is politics which sometimes, unfortunately, is played with the citizenry of the African continent. I hope the South African conference, as it takes place, that leaders look at really the challenges and the concerns raised by the U.S., which are very legitimate, but also that Africans look slightly much more inward to see how best we're able to expand, if you like, our industrial bases, expand our capacities and markets, and also create possibilities in which then we are competitive enough so that we don't have to go and beg for, if you like, for tax exemptions in nation states like South Africa. As it may, it happens that early this morning I was on a television set with one of the junior ministers for foreign affairs in Uganda, and he was actually being rather defensive, which was rather quite unfortunate. The guy is a friend of mine and an old school colleague of mine, but they tend to argue dismissively that this thing will not impact on the citizenry. Of course it does. In 2020, when in 2000 or thereabout, when this matter was coming up, and it was an opportunity for all, simply because you then go ahead and disagree politically, it does not mean, therefore, that you go ahead and dismiss, the impact. Also, in today's independent publication, the Monitor newspaper in Uganda, the Minister of State for National Guidance suggests that very apparently, which is basic at the core of the human rights issues here, is linked, if you like, to the nuanced questions to homosexuality, a legislation which was passed in Uganda recently. That as it may, regardless of political opinions, I just don't know who advised the Ugandan authorities to take bait on this so that we are ending in a situation in which whatever happens at the top, it is the average Ugandan who's bound to suffer. But that said, and finally conclusively on this, it's not necessarily the case that AGOA will mean the end of life for the average Ugandan, the end of life for industry in this country. The tie and the shirt that I'm putting on is from Marks and Spencer's in the UK. My then political party, UPC, that was toppled by Idi Amin in the 60s, managed to organize this country to push a situation in which Uganda used to export fabrics to the topmost companies in the UK and the US. So it is still possible that we're able to live without AGOA, but we cannot dismiss the impact of AGOA on, if you like, particular small industry.
When you say that government has been rather dismissive of the United States decision to terminate AGOA for Uganda, I'd like you to put it into words, particularly coming from the government authorities. What exactly is the wording that they are putting to this?
one, as I said, of the Minister for National Guidance is the suggestion that they will not be coerced or blackmailed when it comes to the question of their values. As I said, those are very apparent nuances to the question of homosexuality. But beyond that, when you talk about human rights, it's not only about homosexuality. It's the fact that just the other week, the official leader of opposition in Uganda was whisked off an aircraft onto his home. Many of the legislators at the moment, the last several weeks, are boycotting Parliament simply because they're raising concerns about missing citizens, people who are missing, people who are in concentration, rather in if you like, unclassified detention centers and ungazetted, as it were. And despite the public outcry, no formal response has been received by the state. So it's really some of these other things. By the way, one of the other ones very quickly. Female legislators beaten up in front of the National Assembly. So those are some of the other issues that you cannot dismiss, that the U.S. is blackmailing you on questions of your own values. And if your own values, I don't know what those values are. Finally, one of the things that the U.S. raises is the question of child labor in this country. You can't talk child labor and dismiss it as a blackmail. It's important. It's one of those things that should really be very, very close to the heart of any average African government or African policy today in terms of conversation. These are things that we need to stop. But we also need to know that the regime in Kampala is a regime that used child soldiers as the backbone of his campaign, for coming into government. So maybe some of these things are normalities. But no, we want to go beyond 2023 so that, when you have a parliamentary system, we must be able to respect the institutions of parliament. When we say we are a democracy, we must be acting in such a manner that, yes, we are part of a global community, but does not mean, therefore, that we pick and choose what aspect of democracy applies and what aspect of human rights does apply to us. Finally, on the homosexuality question, it happens to be the case that one of the very documented cases over 20-25 years ago was the case in which Ugandan state authorities, men were reported, and this is on, you can see in the public domain, Ugandan soldiers, male soldiers, raped men in northern Ugandan concentration camps of Acholi. So if they did that 25 years ago, is it the guys who still come up today and simply say that they're so fundamentally opposed to homosexuality that anybody who's involved in the practice is subjected to death penalty? That is hypocrisy from both sides, isn't it?
Yeah. Mr. Ochieno, let's talk about what precipitated this. And for some people that would have watched developments in Uganda recently, it'll be easy for them to try and draw conclusions that this has to have been about just the homosexuality bill, which was enacted not so long ago. And we even saw marches, by the way, even here in Johannesburg, by some political parties saying that this is wrong, what the Ugandan government is doing. But there are other issues, perhaps, that would have galvanized the United States to act in this way. For example, the elections period. We all know, and we would have seen the treatment of opposition leaders in that country. Yeah. You spoke about abductions that perhaps are still on the go. Are all of these that I'm mentioning, do you think that it is indeed what has led the United States to say human rights violations, clearly you do not put a premium on that and we cannot associate, therefore?
No, you're absolutely right, and as I suggested, as nuanced in one of my responses, that no, this is not only about, if you like, sweeping human rights violations per se. I simply say that when Uganda was listed in to enjoy this privilege, Uganda was also blessed by visits by up to 2 U.S. Presidents. At the time, Uganda was the destination of choice for U.S. leaders and political activists. But at the time, Uganda had political parties banned, and at the time, Uganda was subjecting part of its own citizenry, northern Uganda, if you like, to a genocidal war. So really, it's not really about human rights per se. It is the case that the relationship between the U.S. and the current Ugandan authorities is on a downward trajectory. I'm not sure whether it's going to change anytime soon. It is the case that it's also about geopolitics. Mr. Museveni managed to play these guys substantially in the Great Lakes region. Remember, Museveni and Kagame nearly sent Africa to its first World War drawing up to and including your South Africa and SADC, as part of SADC at the time, Zimbabwe and Angola and others. In Congo, basically, that very well-known 90s kind of conflict. Uganda was at the heart of this, Kagame was at the heart of it, and it was basically they're playing, if you like, head boy policy for global exploitation. That has dynamically changed. Uganda then was substantially a good boy in terms of whipping in, if you like, the underbelly of the Arab world, meaning the Sudan at the time. It no longer applies. Relations have changed, and as I say, Russia is now a player, China is a bigger player, and these days even Turkey can come around and play games, and whatever the case, I think if you're talking usefulness and strategic politics, it is geopolitics, it's economics, it's human rights, but it's also the case that Mr. Museveni is a tired man, and surely people who've been having him as a friend for the last 40 years must also really be reviewing their position. So it's all those plus every other that you see and that we committed 10 years ago and was let off, and now today you go ahead and play brinkmanship. As I said, Mr. Museveni played brinkmanship with the homosexuality legislation. This Uganda's statute books had sufficient provisions to deal with the matters of homosexuality without necessarily enacting a new law. So whether Mr. Museveni was trying to taste the waters the other end and it simply did not work, it may be something that has just backfired.
Joseph Ochieno, thank you very much for your insights here. He is a writer and commentator on African affairs.